Phantom of Mischief by Janessa Harvey. A story about a talented phantom thief who faces a most intriguing challenge. Mr. Mischief smiled to himself as he thought about what he planned to do. Now that his name had gone around as a famous thief, people had begun challenging him to commit more and more impossible feats. For his next job, he had been challenged to steal Soral Voila's favorite pen. Most people would not think much of stealing a pen, but Soral was a famous designer and a billionaire who everyone knew was a bit eccentric. To be honest, Mr. Mischief had no desire to take Soral's beloved pen, but a challenge was a challenge. He walked over to a full-body mirror and struck a dramatic pose as he examined himself. His blue top hat with a white ribbon was tipped slightly on his head, shading his flashy masquerade mask. The mask was also a neon blue with gold and silver design flaring out from the eye holes. They made his eyes and hair seem bronze as he looked through it. And around his body was a shining cape, a slight shade darker than the rest of his blue clothing, but it shimmered in the light. With a sigh, Mr. Mischief removed his elaborate disguise and looked at himself in the mirror. In a short time, he had transformed from an exciting phantom thief into a boring businessman. His eyes now looked like ordinary honey brown. His hair, though it had many natural hints of bronze, seemed a light brown without the contrast. It looked like it was time to face the public. He set his disguise aside and locked it in a file drawer before walking out of his private office. What was he supposed to say to the press? "Soral!" someone behind him called. He glanced back to see his secretary, Michael. The youthful boy was panting from running to find him. "The press is here and they want to hear your statements about the challenge given to the phantom thief, Mr. Mischief." "Well, I certainly want to find out who challenged him, but I can't tell them that," Soral replied, getting a wry smile. He wondered what the press would think if they knew that he was Mr. Mischief. "What about your pen?" Michael asked. "I suppose I will have to protect it," Soral answered. "But for now, how about we let the press ask the questions? Explaining things twice is a pain." Michael nodded and directed him to where the reporters were waiting. This was going to be interesting at the very least. "I'm here," Soral called as he entered the room, giving everyone a bright smile. "Now, ladies first, what do you want to know?" "What are your plans to protect the pen Mr. Mischief plans to steal?" the woman in front demanded. Soral laughed lightly. "If I told you that, wouldn't that be just like informing him?" he asked. "He could be anyone after all." Another jumped in before she could answer. "What will you do if he does steal your pen?" she demanded. "I guess I will eat cookies," Soral decided after a moment. "From what I hear, he usually returns his treasures within the week with a plate of delicious cookies." This time, a male reporter was daring enough to step in. "All of the other plates have been confiscated by the police," he told Soral. "Are you sure you intend to eat evidence?" "If they haven't found the cookie crumb trail by now, they won't find it in one more batch," Soral stated. "Besides, you know how I like my treats." Soral winked at the end of his statement. The police weren't supposed to get those cookies. They were for the victims only. He would have to find a way to stop that nonsense. "I suppose I will let the guy in charge of Mr. Mischief's case enter my mansion," Soral pondered. "But perhaps it would be safer... Here I go. I almost gave my plans away to the little rascal. Personally, I think I will be setting a few things up. They wanted Mr. Mischief to be challenged. I will give him a challenge like never seen before." The reporters seemed astonished by the playful tone in his voice, but Soral couldn't help it. This was going to be fun. However, he would have to be careful when setting his own traps. He couldn't act too knowledgeable about them, but it wouldn't do to get trapped in them either. "Has he announced his time of theft yet?" another reporter jutted in. "Not yet," Soral replied mysteriously. "I'll be sure to tell you when he does. You may go." It was impossible to miss the dismissal. Soral just turned around and left the conference room so that he would be able to think properly. He'd never had to play both sides before, and it was not going to be easy. On the other hand, it really did sound like a lot of fun. After all, Soral lived for a challenge, and who better to challenge him than himself? Perhaps he could hypnotize himself to forget? Make all the traps look the same so he didn't know which one he was coming up on? More importantly, how was he going to keep the police from taking his cookies? Whatever the case, it was time to send himself a little riddle. The next day, he stood in front of the press and read the riddle out loud. I know what you were planning and appreciate the challenge. However, at midnight, July 14th, I will give you a show that puts all of your preparations to shame. By morning, your pen will be gone, but it will never leave. What do you think it means? The frontmost reporter demanded. I suspect he either has incredible inside information in this case, or he's bluffing, Soral proposed. He's going to be flashy about it, and I will bet that last line means he will hide it somewhere within my own mansion. Soral paused and tapped a finger on his chin. Perhaps I should have become a detective instead of a fashion designer, he wondered. But it just wouldn't fit in with my other professions. For some reason, when people tried to think of all of Soral's professions, they seemed to get headaches. Perhaps, to them, being a famous architect, fashion designer, and chef was too diverse. It wasn't as if he did nothing, but he was amazing at training people to do his job for him, and finding the right ones to do it. Very few people actually got a building that was personally designed by Soral, and when he came out with a new clothing set, it was big news. Of course, no one knew that he had a mischievous hobby on top of all this. If he was lucky, they would never find out. The 14th of July was less than a week away. It was time to begin preparations. At 9 in the evening, Soral invited the police inspector to take a look at the traps and precautions he had prepared and, of course, to explain his plan for catching Mr. Mischief in the act. Sometime around 10, he announced that he wouldn't hang around to watch. After all, he was a busy man. Needless to say, the police were shocked. At 11, he went to his secret chamber to finish various preparations and make sure he had all his supplies. Minutes before midnight, Mr. Mischief slipped out of the secret chamber disguised as the tech guy. There would have to be several running around with all the technological traps he planned for himself, and disguising as a police officer was far too obvious. He walked over to the nearest set-up trap and started to check it out. Hey, get away from there, a policeman shouted. That thing could go off. Mr. Mischief glanced back at the policeman. I need to make sure the trap is functional, he reported, disguising his voice to sound deeper. Besides, we checked out the traps beforehand, and none of them were dangerous. The policeman still seemed concerned, but he let it rest. He was most likely new at this sort of thing. Mr. Mischief checked out the trap further and grinned. It was the laser sensor-activated one. Now all he had to do was figure out where the lasers were. It looked like all of the lasers were set on the ground, so it'd be easiest if he just went over them. However, that could end badly if the next trap was the glue corridor. Walls, ceiling, and floor would be covered in sticky pads 5 feet long. However, a little water and the glue would dissolve. Mr. Mischief pulled out suction cups and calmly started to climb sideways along the higher areas of the wall. What are you doing? The policeman demanded. Mr. Mischief grinned. I am going to steal a pen, he stated. You don't mind, do you? I left you a muffin to compensate. The policeman narrowed his eyes and did not go anywhere near the muffin. So he wasn't new enough to fall for the muffin trick. Mr. Mischief swung back to the ground, swiped the muffin up, and stuffed it in the policeman's mouth before he could react. The policeman froze and tried not to swallow, but Mr. Mischief gave him no choice. He acts like I'm trying to kill him, he complained as the policeman finally swallowed and went limp. My muffins only have tranquilizer. He moved the policeman to a couch and went back to the wall so that he could proceed as planned. Crawling along the wall was hard. Gravity did not agree with the exercise, but it should be over soon. When the corridor turned, Mr. Mischief slipped around the corner. There was no way the first trap would sense him now. He grinned. Ahead in the corridor was another trap. This one could sense body heat in close proximity. Mr. Mischief would have to stay at least 3 feet away from it, or an alarm would sound. Of course, it had been placed in a narrow corridor, and there was not 3 feet to walk on either side of it. His arms hurt from the earlier wall-climbing escapade, so he would have to use another method. A couple seconds later, Mr. Mischief shot out a grappling hook and started preparing to make a zip line for himself to zoom across. It wouldn't be very stable, so he would have to be prepared for its collapse not too long after he got on. There would be no time for hesitation. Mr. Mischief hopped on and zipped past the second trap. Unfortunately, he fell right into the third. It was the glued corridor he had been anticipating earlier. He squirmed slightly. The glue was definitely strong enough to hold a man. Now where did that squirt gun go? He smiled as he found it hidden in his jacket. He sprayed the salt water at the glue surrounding him, and it started to bubble and dissolve. He jumped back to his feet and sprayed a walking path for him through the remaining glue. Now all that should be left were the police and a cage trap. The cage trap was most likely set up around the pen. If he had enough time, he would be able to pick the lock and escape, but that was only if he wasn't under the watchful eyes of the police. Mr. Mischief walked along the corridors he knew would lead to the pen's display podium, but was disturbed by the lack of police to stop him. Perhaps he should not have advised the police inspector to get creative. He hesitated at the doors to the room before using a smoke bomb to blind the cameras as he switched from the tech guy disguise to his Mr. Mischief outfit. Then he pushed the doors open with a bang, stepping into the room, followed by the fading cloud of smoke. Just as he had worried, there was a large gathering of policemen in the room. "Nice to see you again," he told them cheerfully. "Would any of you like to grab me that pen there? I need to write something down." No one fell for it. Not that Mr. Mischief had expected them to. "Surround him!" the inspector ordered. "Don't let him get away!" Mr. Mischief danced out of the way of the police officers as they attempted to surround him, pushing a remote in his pocket. Suddenly, there was a maze of mirrors in the room. Every wall had been covered in mirrors, and the podium had been enclosed in mirrors as well, with Mr. Mischief inside. "He's gone!" the inspector shouted angrily. "Inspector, the entire podium has vanished," one of the policemen called. Mr. Mischief held in a chuckle. He didn't want them to discover his trick yet. He snatched the pen and opened the podium, before slipping through the trap door underneath. He closed both doors behind him. Now all he had to do was hide the pen and reappear as Soral. He followed the secret tunnel under the floor to an empty room he had set up. He opened the trap door and slipped out. Mr. Mischief slipped out of the room, still in his ostentatious outfit. And after a few moments, he grinned, seeing the inspector's hat hanging on a hat rack near the door. He went over to it and slipped the pen in its brim. Then he opened a window, setting off the alarm at last. By the time the police had made it to the door, he was running to it as Soral. "I heard the alarms," he announced. "What happened?" "Mr. Mischief got away with your pen," a policeman reported. Soral sighed. "Well, it is just a pen," he replied. "I can live without it. Want a cookie?" He took a bite of a cookie from the plate he was holding as he asked. "Where did you get those?" the inspector demanded. "I found them in my car," Soral explained. "They're really delicious." "Oh, and they came with a note for you." The inspector took the note and read it. Soral could remember what he had written clearly and walked past him. It read, "Dear Inspector, please stop stealing my apology cookies from people. It is a rather heartless thing to do. Oh yes, tonight was fun. We should do it again sometime. Mr. Mischief."